Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am Amanda, an amateur writer and general lover of words. This is part 2 in my series on Dune Messiah, the sequel to Dune by Frank Herbert. If you haven't seen the first part, then I do recommend that you check that one out. And while you're at it, you could check out my video on the first book as well. But I guess that if you've recently read the books, you should be able to follow along for this video. This is part of my series, Good Lines Micro Appreciation, where we get into the closest of details. And this is your spoiler alert, I guess. I realize that I haven't said those words in the other videos, but that's practically what they are, just long spoilers. And I know that I'm probably a bit weird in not caring about spoilers. I'm rarely discouraged by them, at least. I would like these videos to be about us appreciating skillful writing together. That would be nice. Maybe there's someone who doesn't want to read the books but still want to know what they're about because they're in the zeitgeist or whatever. The blockbuster movies might have something to do with that. But if that's the case, then this is perfect for you. For both the other videos, I've neglected to discuss the lovely cover art for the books, so why not do that now? And I think it's beautiful. I would have it as, art on my walls if I could. Maybe I can look into whether I can buy it and put it up because it is really pretty. And this is the first book, a lone figure in a desert, and I'm guessing the figure is Paul. Who else would it be? And there's a Fremen saying that in the desert you can see an enemy coming from a long way off. And Paul is longing for the simpler days in the desert when the enemy was tangible, rather than this shadowy conspiracy against him. The second book, the one we're talking about today, is also really pretty, I think. It's very nicely symbolic also, because it's the figure, Paul, I'm guessing, on the apex of a pyramid, but still very much alone. And it's also very interesting that it's at night, which matches a vision of Paul's, which we'll be talking about shortly. What do you think about the covers of this edition? I think it really adds a lot. It took me a bit too long to put out the first video on Dune Messiah, because I got some conflicting emotions about the story, and it made me very reluctant to work on the video. I wrote an article on my conflicting feelings. If anyone is interested in reading about my conflicting feelings about the story so far, I will post a link in the description box to the magazine when it's published. And the magazine itself isn't in English, but my article is, and would be pretty easy to find if you look. I'm not gonna go into details here and now because it's YouTube. There are things you shouldn't say, but in the article, I don't think I really have to censure myself in the same way. I don't know if anyone would be interested in reading it, but it is the reason that I procrastinated so much. And it wasn't wasted time. I found a new game. Well, it's not a new game. It was new to me. Roots of Pacha. It's a wonderful time sink. It reminds of a original Harvest Moon type game, but it's better because it's new. So if you want to procrastinate from something, then I thoroughly recommend. And there's also mods on it, so you can improve the quality of life aspects quite a bit. Anyway, to quickly recap the first video, Paul is torn between two terrible futures, not communicating properly with anyone. I'm frustrated by the vagueness employed when referring to these futures, and there are contradictions about how much Paul actually sees. The Bene Tleilac Sightale has killed and replaced a Fremen woman, the daughter of Othame, as a step in the conspiracy between him, Helen Gaius Mahayim, and a navigator called Edric, who is now stationed as an ambassador in Paul's court. Alia has a growing intimacy with the Gola of Duncan, Idaho, Hate, which is very frustrating for her. She's also frustrated by the fact that she can't see part of her own future, including her future partner. She's also not happy being a religious icon, but it's a role necessary to underpin Paul's role. We had a few uncomfortable moments, and there are more to come, most of them about the Fremen. I really don't understand the choices Herbert made about the Fremen. They are generally worse as a people, and I don't know why Frank is doing this to them, and I am quite disappointed by it, actually. Chapter 11. Paul has taken a big dose of spice to have a vision, because his prescient powers are hampered by the prevalence of the Dune tarot. What he sees is a vision of the moon falling, and the vision, though vague, seems to decide his course of action. The moon here can represent several things: his rule, him as an emperor, the faith of the Fremen, but it very much represents a cataclysmic end to something. The symbolism is so heavy that it's frustrating that you don't learn exactly what it means, but we'll get to that eventually. But this frustrated feeling of not knowing exactly what it means is sort of a theme for this whole book, I think. Spoiler alert, this whole video. It doesn't lead to Paul discrediting himself, which is what the Bene Tleilax are confident that Paul will do. There are more recitations of specific places on Earth, which unfortunately adds to the exotification of the Fremen. A shower of sweet odors from a garden roof nibbled at his senses, but no floral perfume could roll back that fallen moon. Nice use of nibbled. It had taken a massive dose of the spice essence to penetrate the mud thrown up by the tarot. All it had shown him was a falling moon and the hateful way he'd known from the beginning. To buy an end for the Yason, to silence the volcano of butchery, he must discredit himself. As I said, I don't understand how this is represented in the actual ending of the book. The opposite seems to be true, in fact. But even Shaney could not exorcise his vision. What would Shaney say if he went to her with the statement that he had a particular death in mind? Knowing it to be inevitable, why not choose an aristocrat's death, ending life on a secret flourish, squandering any years that might have been? To die before coming to the end of willpower, was that not an aristocrat's choice? Paul's secrecy made manifest. If he had brought his concerns to someone he trusted, there would be a chance of working something out. I think that he doesn't, because he believes that he is sparing Cheney a premature defeat. A feeling came over him that the city out there had been translated into an odd symbol for his universe. The buildings he could see had been erected on the plain where his Fremen had obliterated the Sardaukar legions. Ground once trampled by battles rang now to the rushing clamor of business. It's nice symbolism that his empire was built on the ending battle of the previous book. Paul passed a hand across his forehead and eyes. The symbol metropolis oppressed him. He despised his own thoughts. Such vacillation in another would have aroused his anger. Nice use of symbol metropolis. Rage rooted in boredom flickered and simmered deep within him, nurtured by decisions that couldn't be avoided. He knew which path his feet must follow. He'd seen it enough times, hadn't he? Seen it. Once, long ago, he'd thought of himself as an inventor of government, but the invention had fallen into old patterns. It was like some hideous contrivance with plastic memory. Shape it any way you wanted, but relax for a moment and it snapped into the ancient forms. Forces at work beyond his reach in human breasts eluded and defied him. This sounds very much like the natural law to me. And it's frustrating not knowing whether Frank is being subtle or if I just don't understand what he means. Also, nice use of plastic. Superb artistry, abutted inexplicable prodigies of dismal tastelessness. Details impressed themselves upon him. A postern out of most ancient Baghdad, a dome dreamed in mythical Damascus, an arch from the low gravity of Attar, harmonious elevations and queer depths, all created an effect of unrivaled magnificence. Nice use of abutted, but also exotification. Frustration tangled him. Nice use of tangled. He felt the pressure of mass unconscious, that burgeoning sweep of humankind across his universe. They rushed upon him with a force like a gigantic tidal bore. He sensed the vast migrations at work in human affairs, eddies, currents, gene flows. No dams of abstinence, no seizures of impotence, nor maledictions could stop it. Again, natural law elevated to a universal level. Also, nice use of gene flows. Muad'Dib's Jason was less than an eye blink in this larger movement. The Bene Gesserit swimming in this tide, that corporate entity trading in genes, was trapped in the torrent as he was. Visions of a falling moon must be measured against other legends, other visions in a universe where even the seemingly eternal stars waned, flickered, died. Nice application of corporate entity to the Bene Gesserit. Burial indeed, the Ghola said. You run from death. You strain at the next instant, refuse to live here and now. Augury, what a crutch for an emperor. The central conflict of Paul. He condemns himself. He let the vision flow over him then. Though his whole being shrieked, no sound escaped him. He was afraid to speak, fearful that his voice might betray him. The air of this terrifying future was thick with Cheney's absence. Flesh that had cried in ecstasy, eyes that had burned him with their desire, the voice that had charmed him because it played no tricks of subtle control, all gone, back into the water and the sand. If you think about what matters to Paul personally, it's not the empire or being the Mahdi to the Fremen. It's Cheney, and this line formed a knot in my stomach. Paul knew Cheney long before they even met because he had prescient dreams about her before they even got to the dune. So her absence would be the worst thing, wouldn't it? Even comparable to the moon falling. Still, his vision lay before him. Its terrible purpose gave him no choice. Apparently, terrible purpose he'll never escape. Chapter 12. Paul confronts Mohiam about the plans to kill Cheney, and it builds curiosity about the absence of Irulan. After a bit of show and circumstance, Paul reveals that Cheney is pregnant. In exchange for her life, he offers the Bene Gesserit the artificial insemination of Irulan and her subsequent banishment. They will thus receive Paul's gene for their program, but not have control of the throne, which was the purpose behind only allowing Irulan's father, Shaddam IV, to have daughters and not sons. Rather than accepting this partial victory, Mohiam stalls decision by claiming that she needs to discuss it with the other Bene Gesserit leadership. But it's not before having the absolute gall of making the suggested counteroffer for Paul to impregnate Alia to deliver the purest genes. Alia seems to miss this suggestion, thankfully. In order to accomplish the artificial insemination, they would enlist the help of the BT, and Paul has flashes of bargaining with them at some point. Damn his mother for all eternity. It was her fault the Bene Gesserit had lost their hold on this gene line. If we want to dispense blame, Jessica is a product of the Bene Gesserit, of Mohiam specifically. So whose fault was it that she was an imperfect servant? Silence surged along the vaulted passages ahead of her entourage. She sensed the word being passed. Paul would hear the silence. He'd know of her coming before it was announced. She didn't delude herself with ideas that her powers exceeded his. These beginning passages of the chapter made me feel an absence of descriptions of the palace previously. For this book, I have more quotes per page, but it's more because there's more things to pick apart, not individual lines to appreciate. So there's less fluff in this book, and I sort of miss it. I like the fluff in books. The guards herded her around a corner into another of the seemingly endless vaulted passages. Triangular metaglass windows on her left gave a view upward to trellised vines and indigo flowers in deep shadows cast by the afternoon sun. Tiles lay underfoot, figures of water creatures from exotic planets, water reminders everywhere, wealth, riches. I'd never noticed the word trellised before, which means having or being furnished with a trellis or a lattice arrangement, trained upon a trellis. Example, trellised roses. The immensity of this Aegir citadel began to impress her. Passages, passages. They passed an open doorway, from which emerged the sound of timbre and flute playing soft elder music. A glance showed her blue in blue Fremen eyes staring from the room. She sensed in them the ferment of legendary revolts stirring in wild genes. Googling Aegir led me to a Reddit post saying that it is a Berber word meaning hill. And it is interesting to see the citadel populated. The size of the citadel began to oppress her. Would the passages never end? The place reeked of terrifying physical power. No planet, no civilization in all human history had ever before seen such man-made immensity. A dozen ancient cities could be hidden in its walls. This is all a ploy to impress Paul's power on Mohiam, and she realizes as much. Also, ancient has lost its descriptive force here, I think. It could be ancient Athens or modern-day Tokyo. Without seeming to do so, the hall grew smaller at its far end, refusing to dwarf Paul on his throne centered on a dais. An untrained awareness, shocked by surrounding proportions, would see him at first as many times larger than his actual size. Colors played upon the unprotected psyche. Paul's green throne had been cut from a single Hagar emerald. It suggested growing things and, out of the Fremen mythos, reflected the mourning color. It whispered that here sat he who could make you mourn. Life and death in one symbol, a clever stress of opposites. It is interesting to me to think about how the staging around Paul must have been constructed quickly to be established by this time. It's only been 12 years. At some point, this was all being made, and I'm curious about what it was like then. Paul's throne is also one step up from Shaddam's, which was made out of a single piece of jade. Behind the throne, draperies cascaded in burnt orange, carried gold of Dune earth, and cinnamon flakes of melange. To a trained eye, the symbolism was obvious, but it contained hammer blows to beat down the uninitiated. I don't know. If you don't understand the symbolism, are you really affected by it? The Reverend Mother measured the minutes required to approach the imperial presence at her hobbling pace. You had time to be cowed. Any tendency toward resentment would be squeezed out of you by the unbridled power which focused down upon your person. You might start the long march toward that throne as a human of dignity, but you ended the march as a gnat. Mohiam is a force to be reckoned with, no doubt, aside from her despicable character. She noted now the absence of Cheney and Irulan, wondered at it. He held no important audience without them, so it was said. I kept imagining Irulan as imprisoned during this time, but that's never stated. You dare such gaucheries with a Bene Gesserit, she asked. Gross actions carry their own messages, Paul said. She hesitated, weighed his words. So, he might yet dispense with her. Grossly, obviously, if she what? I think arranging the death of a dictator's romantic interest is quite enough to warrant quite a gross ending. She realized then why he had greeted her in the hall. A dumb show for the guards and naibs. He feared them then. And now he displayed a kindly benevolence, daring such wiles on a Bene Gesserit. Or was it daring? She sensed another presence behind, glanced back to see Alia following. The younger woman's eyes held a brooding, baleful cast. The Reverend Mother shuddered. It is still amusing that the Reverend Mother has always been afraid of Alia. Have you had a vision of my hand in her death? The Reverend Mother asked. She kept her attention on the Gola, oddly disturbed by him. Why should she feel threatened by the Gola? He was a tool of the conspiracy. The Bene Gesserit have heightened, honed senses of intuition, and Scytale was very confident that the only one who would win anything in the conspiracy is the Bene Slaylax. We'll not discuss the things your sisterhood forbids, Paul said. I will listen to no talk of sins, abominations, or the beliefs left over from past Jasons. You may have my seed for your plans, but no child of Irulans will sit on my throne. Mohiam is here offended that Paul offered artificial insemination when that is against some moral code left over from the Butlerian. The Reverend Mother closed her eyes to hide his face. Damnation! To cast the genetic dice in such a way! Loathing boiled in her chest. The teaching of the Bene Gesserit, the lessons of the Butlerian Jason, all prescribed such an act. One did not demean the highest aspirations of humankind. No machine could function in the way of a human mind. No word or deed could imply that men might be bred on the level of animals. I was worried that we wouldn't get an explanation for the ban on artificial insemination, since it doesn't really have to do with artificial intelligence. Paul obviously doesn't care. The Reverend Mother understood now the subtle depth of Paul's offer. He would make the Bene Gesserit party to an act which would bring down popular wrath were it ever discovered. They could not admit such paternity if the Emperor denied it. This coin might save the Atreides genes for the sisterhood, but it would never buy a throne. I do appreciate the cleverness of this offer, and it shows the arrogance of Mohiam that she thinks that she can outwit Paul, that the conspiracy will be successful to the extent that they can wrest a greater concession from him. Gaius Helen Mohiam and all the Reverend Mothers within her shuddered. Yes, the Tleilaxo did loathsome things. If one let down the barriers to artificial insemination, was the next step a Tleilaxo one? Controlled mutation? The slippery slope argument is always sort of bad as far as arguments go. You stop a slippery slope by stopping. It's not really that difficult. I do like the reminder that Mohiam also carries the memories of all her predecessors. Gaius Helen Mohiam's head snapped around, and she met Alia's gaze. For a flashing instant, they were two Reverend Mothers together, communing on a single thought. What lay behind any Tleilaxo action? The Gola was a Tleilaxo thing. Had he put this plan into Paul's mind? Would Paul attempt to bargain directly with the Bene Tleilax? Technically, they could force insemination on Irulan without the Bene Gesserit approving of it, and Paul yielding something to the Bene Tleilax would drive a wedge into the conspiracy as much as the Bene Gesserit getting what they want in a naturally impregnated Irulan, as Cheney suggested in the beginning. Controlled mutation, she thought. Did a Tleilaxo really practice it? How tempting. She shook her head, the better to rid it of such thoughts. The Bene Tleilax are scientific amoralists. Of course they practice it. And again she looked at the sister. The optimum cross for this female Atreides had been lost, killed by Paul. Another possibility remained, however, one which would cement the desired characteristic into an offspring. Paul dared offer animal breeding to the Bene Gesserit. How much was he really prepared to pay for his Cheney's life? Would he accept a cross with his own sister? It is fascinating that Mohiam is getting worked up about animal breeding when she keeps thinking in terms used when breeding animals. She consistently calls it a cross rather than a match or mate or anything else but a cross. Alia refused to look at Stilgar. It was a wrong decision. She could feel this in every cell. Paul must know it. Why had he fixed himself upon such a path? Paul has declared that they will go to Siege Tabar so that Cheney will give birth in the desert, and Alia obviously knows that something will go wrong with this. Alia crossed to her brother, seeing his utter sadness. She touched a tear on his cheek with a Fremen gesture of awe, said, "We must not grieve for those dear to us before their passing." "Before their passing," Paul whispered. "Tell me, little sister, what is before?" This is so sad. I was always horrified by Paul having to consistently live with the worst case scenario for every scenario all the time. Chapter 13. It's a very short chapter in which Scytale informs Edric that he must prompt hate to attempt to remember his past life, which we have been told is impossible for a Gola. And it also doesn't seem that hate needs that encouragement. It also reinforces that both the Guild and the Bene Tleilax are concerned by the potential in Alia, alike but different from Paul. Being a fertile female also means that she can continue the line. The patriarchy is still going strong. The chameleon thinks a change of shape will hide him from anything, Edric thought with rare insight, and he wondered if his presence in the conspiracy truly hid them from all oracular powers. The Emperor's sister now. A nice subtle dig at Edric, the Guild's member that no one likes, and it goes unanswered whether an oracle disguises everything it touches. It doesn't seem to be the case, but nothing less would suffice to hide anything from Paul. Oddly, the steersman roiled in agitation, threshing his limbs like some weird newt. Sighthill fought a sense of loathing at the sight. The Guild navigator wore his usual dark leotard, bulging at the belt with various containers. Yet, he gave the impression of nakedness when he moved. It was a swimming, reaching movement, Sighthill decided, and he was struck once more by the delicate linkages of their conspiracy. They were not a compatible group. That was weakness. I think that it's rather their self-interest, which is their main weakness. Sighthill fears that the Bene Gesserit will accept Paul's offer rather than carry on with the conspiracy. The future had become a muddy stream, clogged with prophets. So who is responsible for spreading the Dune Tarot? I would really like to know, and I won't get an answer in this book, if ever. Chapter 14. It has been 6 weeks, and Cheney has fallen ill, and the doctors inform her that she didn't get pregnant for however long because she was being poisoned. And learning this means that Paul has to talk her down from killing Irulan. One effect of the poison is that both pregnancy and birth will be more difficult for Cheney, and she has to consume more spice to compensate. Prescient Vision had recorded these moments, but he shielded his awareness from the oracle, preferring the role here of a time fish, swimming not where he willed, but where the currents carried him. Destiny permitted no struggles now. Paul has decided on his course, and so he just relents to it. Understandably, he must be exhausted. Also, nice use of the capitalized time fish. He'd face events when Cheney came, Paul told himself. Time enough then to accept the fact that what he'd concealed from her had prolonged her life. Was it evil, he wondered, to prefer Cheney to an heir? By what right did he make that choice for her? Foolish thoughts. Who could hesitate, given the alternatives? Slave pits, torture, agonizing sorrow, and worse. So obviously, Paul has seen Cheney die as a result of her pregnancy, explaining why he has been permitting the poisoning. And yes, it is terribly arbitrary of him to make that decision. And while I've been frustrated by the lack of details about this terrible alternative future, these details don't satisfy me, and I can't sufficiently explain why. It feels somewhat like a trust me bro situation. How does it get that bad? And how is it avoided by Cheney dying? One or the other seems very extreme to me. Murder sat on Cheney's face. The wide Fremen belt, which gathered the waist of her golden robe, the water rings worn as a necklace, one hand at her hip, never far from the knife, the trenchant stare, which was her first inspection of any room. Everything about her stood now only as a background for violence. Nice use of trenchant, as well as a very nice description of Cheney's understandable fury. He watched her accept this. She did it the way sand accepted water, absorbing and concealing. Was there obedience beneath that hot, angry surface, he wondered, and he realized then that life in the royal keep had left Cheney unchanged. She'd merely stopped here for a time, inhabited a way station on a journey with her man. Nothing of the desert had been taken from her. It's not good to kill someone for wronging you, but it's not the best look that Paul needs to restrain Cheney from doing it, since she's a murderous Fremen, I guess. Many attempts have been made, Haight said, his gaze fixed on the floor near his feet. No Gola has ever been restored to his former being. This is a nice reminder of that already established fact, but also that it has been a priority to try to restore these lost memories. Chapter 15. The conspiracy's plan is put into motion. Sightale, disguised as Othaim's daughter, comes to fetch Paul because Othaim has something confidential to tell him. Paul knows that it's Sightale, but goes along with it anyway. He has committed to a terrible course to avoid something even more terrible. If it had been someone else than Othaim's daughter, she would not have successfully gained entry to the palace or been able to fool Cheyne, so it is convenient that Ferox's son targeted her. The plan is for Paul to bring Cheyne in her role as Sayadina, but Paul doesn't agree to this. The girl's voice came out small but firm, giving name, father, and pedigree. Paul nodded. He saw how Cheyne had been fooled. The timbre of the voice, everything reproduced with exactitude. Had it not been for his own Bene Gesserit training in voice and for the web of Tao in which oracular vision enfolded him, this face dancer disguise might have galled even him. I'm not sure what I feels about Paul being able to recognize the near-perfect act of Sightale. I liked it better in my second read, but I do wonder if the tension of the story wouldn't be better served if Paul had been fooled to some extent. Sightale breathed softly. It went well, but now came the crucial task. The Atreides must be guided onto that special path. He must lose his Fremen concubine in circumstances where no other shared the blame. The failure must belong only to the omnipotent Muad'Dib. He had to be led into an ultimate realization of his failure, and thence to an acceptance of the Tleilaxu alternative. I'm not a great fan about how this was phrased. It says that he must lose his Fremen concubine in circumstances where no other shares the blame. It isn't true that it must happen, as we soon find out. Paul's omnipotence does lead him to feel that things are his responsibility, but he does know that some things are out of his control. Paul fought to maintain calmness. He felt naked, his soul abandoned in a groping time concealed from every vision. Powerful oracles hid this face dancer. Only the edges of these moments were known to Paul. He knew only what he could not do. He could not slay this face dancer. That would precipitate the future, which must be avoided at all cost. Somehow a way must be found to reach into the darkness and change the terrifying pattern. The terrible thing, the knot in my stomach, is about Cheyne dying in childbirth. How can he learn something that will make that not happen? Because if Cheyne dies, then other terrible things won't happen? I'm a hint confused. There truly are Fremen in the conspiracy, Paul thought. This moment fitted the shape of things to come for sure, and he had no alternative but to commit himself to this course. So Paul even knows about the conspiracy. So in the first half of this book, he just wasn't saying as much. It's a bit underwhelming, actually. Before Sightale could still them, strange emotions passed over the girl features. Frustration, anger. Sightale was reminded that every victim must have a way of escape, even such a one as Muad'Dib. The conspiracy had not failed, though. This Atreides remained in the net. He was a creature who had developed firmly into one pattern. He'd destroy himself before changing into the opposite of that pattern. That had been the way with the Tleilaxu Kwisatz Haderach. It would be the way with this one, and then the Gola. So he doesn't need to lose Cheyne with no one to blame but himself? Oh, okay. I don't mind the plans within plans, but it feels a hint contrived. And scientists should know better than to rely on a pattern established by one. I'll take Stilgar's wife, Hera, Paul said. You'll tell us the way to your father. Well, F you, Paul. You won't risk Cheyne's life, but Hera is fine? He doesn't, though. He goes to the meeting alone. Should he tell Banerjee about the messenger's true nature, he wondered. No, such an incident hadn't been written on the screen of his vision. Any deviation here carried precipitate violence. A moment of fulcrum had to be found, a place where he could will himself out of the vision, if such a moment existed. Nice use of precipitate, but also, if he hasn't seen the eventuality, how can he know that it leads to unacceptable violence? Vagueness in a story can create intrigue, but with Paul's powers being so built up, I want more details. I do. The lack of details make me suspect that Herbert didn't know himself, which is fine now and again. As a writer, you don't have to be omnipotent about the stories you make, but you don't want your reader to feel that. Chapter 16. Paul attends Alia's service on the way to Othaim's house because the guide will meet him at Alia's fane. It's an interesting view on the religion from a worshipper's point of view. It also adds another layer to knowing that Alia detests performing this function. Paul is in disguise, alone, sort of, being tracked by ornithopters who can swoop in at any time. The religious ceremony is part pomp and part akin to the orgies of the Fremen, where the Reverend Mother changes the water of life and emotions are shared between the participants. Strings of sand clouds lay across the sunset like slatted shutters. Nice use of strings and slatted. How little she understood the better choice. Selecting among agonies, he thought, made even lesser agonies nearly unbearable. How could Shani understand the choices when he doesn't explain them to her? He was down in the press of people now, committed. The only guide his security force could find had insisted it be done this way. Security hadn't liked Paul's ready agreement. Stilgar had liked it even less, and Shani had objected most of all. Shani objects to this plan, and she doesn't even know what Paul is walking into while he does. The crowd around him, even while its members brushed against him, glanced his way unseeing and passed on, gave him a curious freedom of movement. It was the way they'd been conditioned to treat a Fremen he knew. He carried himself like a man of the inner desert. Such men were quick to anger. And still, I'm not happy with this new trait of the Fremen. The temple portico was lined with tall, slender glow tubes simulating candle flame. They flickered. The flickering stirred ancestral memories in Paul, even while he knew that was the intent. This setting was an atavism, subtly contrived, effective. He hated his own hand in it. I do like seeing the contrast between the staging and the authentic religious service Alia provides. The crowd flowed with him through tall metal doors into the gigantic nave, a gloomy place with the flickering lights far away overhead, a brilliantly illuminated altar at the far end. Behind the altar, a deceptively simple affair of black wood encrusted with sand patterns from the Fremen mythology. Hidden lights played on the field of a Prue door to create a rainbow borealis. The 7 rows of chanting acolytes ranked below that spectral curtain took on an eerie quality. Black robes, white faces, mouths moving in unison. Nice description of a rainbow borealis. Paul studied the pilgrims around him, suddenly envious of their intentness, their air of listening to truths he could not hear. It seemed to him that they gained something here which was denied to him, something mysteriously healing. Knowing what goes on behind the curtain would be sort of disappointing, I think. A wailing rebaba yarred across the voices, stilled them, receded into silence. With an electric abruptness, the crowd surged forward several meters. They were packed into a tight mass of flesh now, the air heavy with their breathing and the scent of spice. Nice use of jarred. Paul felt sickened. What are we doing? He asked himself. Alia was a child witch, but she was growing older, and he thought, growing older is to grow more wicked. The maturing of Alia is central in the book, a lot of it through Paul's eyes. He has obviously never seen her in the future because she's an oracle herself. He could sense that element of himself, which was one with those all around him, but the differences formed a deadly contradiction. He stood immersed, isolated in a personal sin which he could never expiate. The immensity of the universe outside the temple flooded his awareness. How could one man, one ritual, hope to knit such immensity into a garment fitted to all men? Nice use of expiate. I have a fondness for highly specified words. They just make me happy. But as a non-native speaker, I do learn English word in a non-organic fashion, sometimes through a word of the day subscription or by cruising Merriam-Webster. So I learn words without knowing how rare they are. Lots of words are simply too specific to be viable in my writing. But whenever I see a word in popular media, I give myself a pass to use it. Expiate is one of them. He stared across the mob in the temple at his sister. She was his sister. He knew her ritual and its roots, but he had never before stood out here with the pilgrims, watched her through their eyes. Here, performing the mystery of this place, he saw that she partook of the universe which opposed him. Throughout the book, there are obvious attempts to differentiate Paul's powers from Alia's, and I approve, because it makes her into a more interesting character. Paul felt that he waited for some private signal from his sister. It could be any action or word, something of wizardry and mystical processes, an outward streaming that would fit him like an arrow into a cosmic bow. This instant lay like a quivering mercury in his awareness. Nice use of quivering mercury. Paul suppressed a cry of disappointment as Alia lowered her head. She had not said the thing he waited to hear. His body felt like a dry shell, a husk abandoned by some desert insect. Depending on a straight answer from mysticism isn't really the safest bet, but I guess that's what makes people go back for seconds. Alia lifted her head, and Paul had the giddy sensation that the distance between them collapsed, that he stared directly into her glazed eyes only inches away from her. Nice use of collapsed. I should know what Alia saw, he thought. I have seen it enough times myself. And she didn't cry out against it. She saw the alternatives too. I'm beginning to feel that the build-up about all these terrible alternatives is a way to excuse the fact that Paul chooses the course of action that leads to Cheney's death. I'm not sure about it at all. It's just a feeling I have. Chapter 17. Paul arrives at the house of Othame, where he is greeted by the not correctly termed dwarf, which contains the distrans information of all the Fremen in the conspiracy against Paul. Google, that wonderful, reliable source, says that dwarf isn't the best term to use for someone who has dwarfism, but it's not the worst either. And we sort of have to remember that this was published in the 60s, and it's not even defined whether this character has dwarfism. I just don't know. I'm gonna go with it. And this is the character named as the Catalyst Dwarf in the chapter where Scytale kidnaps Othame's daughter, which I missed in my first read. So the reader is supposed to know that he is part of the plan in the conspiracy. Paul hasn't foreseen the role of this character because he has some oracular powers, which is quite clever. Until you apply that cleverness to the fact that the BT obviously have the ability to create such oracular powers. So I don't really understand why they use Scytale as much as they do. They would need a plain face dancer to impersonate a normal person, but Scytale should have a lesser role, in my opinion, or they wouldn't be so dependent on Edric, whom no one likes or respects, for that matter. The air around him was thick with the smell of a reclamation still. The thing must be poorly capped for its fetid odors to escape, losing a dangerous, wasteful amount of moisture into the night air. How careless his people had grown, Paul thought. They were millionaires of water, forgetful of the days when a man on Arrakis could have been killed for just an eighth share of the water in his body. I included this quote because it shows the decadence of a rich culture, but also to show the contrast of the Fremen in this book. It is different to kill someone to gain a vitally lacking resource than to kill them for spite. It's not an excuse to kill someone, for sure, but it's not at all like killing someone for petty reasons, like bumping into you. I really don't understand why Herbert made the Fremen change in this direction. Paul's foot caught in a low drift of sand across the street. For an instant, he felt mud clinging to the shoes of his childhood. Then he was back in the sand, in the dust-clouded, wind-muffled darkness, with the future hanging over him, taunting. Nice use of dust-clotted and wind-muffled. You did this. They'd become a civilization of dry-eyed watchers and tale-tellers, people who solved all problems with power, and still more power, hating every erg of it. Paul does hold himself accountable, which is good for his character. Rough stones came underfoot. His vision remembered them. The dark rectangle of a doorway appeared on his right, black in black. Othaim's house, Fate's house, a place different from the ones around it only in the role time had chosen for it. It was a strange place to be marked down in history. I liked the reinforcement that Paul experiences the future as though it has already happened. Paul hesitated. There'd been no dwarf in the vision, but all else remained identical. Visions could contain such disparities and still hold true to their original plunge into infinity, but the difference dared him to hope. The hope doesn't last very long, only serving to add an angst to this destiny. He glanced back up the street at the creamy pearl glistening off his moon, swimming out of jagged shadows. The moon haunted him. How did it fall? But I thought he knew how it falls. I'm confused. Hope was a dervish wind whirling, dancing in Paul. Nice use of dervish wind. It was a dark and gloomy place, the smell of sickness and defeat in it. He felt daunted by the atmosphere. Was it defeat to choose a lesser evil, he wondered? How far down this track had he come? Paul felt vision trapped. This was the way it gone. Nice use of vision trapped. The place had received painstaking care despite its poor furnishings. Hooks and rods across the barren walls showed where hangings had been removed. Pilgrims paid enormous prices for authentic Fremen artifacts, Paul reminded himself. Rich pilgrims counted desert tapestries as treasures, true marks of a Hajj. Paul felt that the barren walls accused him with their fresh gypsum wash. The threadbare condition of the two remaining hangings amplified the sense of guilt. I like the description of commerce following the religion. It's not enough to have completed the pilgrimage yourself. You need authentic souvenirs to show people. It was Othaim, precisely as the vision had revealed him. Neck grown scrawny, a bird thing which appeared too weak to support the large head. The face was a lopsided ruin. Networks of crisscrossed scars on the left cheek below a drooping wet eye, but clear skin on the other side, and a straight, blue-in-blue Fremen gaze. While Paul assumes responsibility, it is his soldiers who suffer. A long kedge of nose bisected the face. Nice use of bisected. The dull drooping eye on the ruined side of the face moved above the parchment skin and scars. Grey bristles stubbled that side, and the jawline there hung with scabrous peelings. Othaim's mouth twisted as he spoke, the gap exposing silvery metal teeth. I like that we're not looking away from the grim realities of the Jason. He felt edgy, constrained by the vision but aware that minor differences had crept in. How could he exploit the differences? Time came out of its skein with subtle changes, but the background fabric held oppressive sameness. He knew with terrifying certainty that if he tried to break out of the enclosing pattern here, it'd become a thing of terrible violence. The power in this deceptively gentle flow of time oppressed him. Nice. We shared Siege Tabar, Paul reminded himself. She has the right to berate me for apparent callousness. Paul's refusal to blame anyone else for his actions is one of his best character traits. Frustrated rage threatened to overwhelm Paul then, that Othaim should be spent thus. A Fedaykin deserved better, but no choice remained, not for a death commando or his emperor. They walked Occam's razor in this room. The slightest misstep multiplied horrors, not just for themselves, but for all humankind, even for those who would destroy them. There must seem to be much more glory in being a holy death commando than a dying veteran. Also, I instinctually really like the use of Occam's razor here, but I don't really make sense of it. I don't know what he means. My dwarf, Othaim wheezed. I bought him on a world I forget. He's a human distrans, a toy discarded by the Tleilaxu. He's recorded all the names, the traitors. So maybe it wasn't a stroke of luck that Farak's son got his hand on Othaim's daughter. Othaim stayed away that he might be numbered among those who hate you, Usul Duri said. The house to the south of us at the end of the street, that is a gathering place for your foes. It's why we took this hovel. It would be a 4D chess move of the Bene Tleilax to put an infiltrator in Othaim's hand whilst on another world. Paul consulted his memory of the vision. In it, he'd left here with the names of the traitors, but never seeing how those names were carried. The dwarf obviously moved under the protection of another oracle. It occurred to Paul then that all creatures must carry some kind of destiny stamped out by purposes of varying strengths, by the fixation of training and disposition. From the moment that Jason had chosen him, he had felt himself hemmed in by the forces of a multitude. Their fixed purposes demanded and controlled his course. Any delusions of free will he harbored now must be merely the prisoner rattling his cage. His curse lay in the fact that he saw the cage. He saw it, which echoes precisely the sentiments of that condemned historians at the very beginning of the book. I was wrong to hope, Paul thought, but thinking of hope brought him a twisted sense of hope, and he felt that he might yet seize his moment. Yeah, but how, though? Usul, that's the base of the pillar, Bijaz said, translating. How can Usul be base when I'm the basest living thing? Based. He's the most based, you guys. I don't speak, Bijaz said. I operate a machine called language. It creaks and groans, but it is mine own. Bijaz is very good at playing the clown, and he fooled me until it was revealed that he is playing. A Tleilaxu toy, learned and alert, Paul thought. The Bene Tleilax never threw away something this valuable. Again, it undermines the cleverness of the Bene Tleilax that Paul immediately realizes that he's an implant. You've truth sense, Paul asked, determined now to wait out the clockwork of his vision. Anything was better than shattering these moments and producing the new consequences. There remained things for Othaim to say, lest time be diverted into even more horrifying channels. Yeah, but how, though? One good thing among the evils, Usul. I don't like the world we're making, you know that. It was better when we were alone in the desert with only the Harkonnens for enemy. Well, it was only the Harkonnen who were visible to the Fremen, but the Emperor saw them as a threat, not to mention the Sardaukar. Every minute I linger defers my guilt, Paul thought. A worm's poisonous breath, its teeth dripping dust, had washed over him. It had happened long ago, but he inhaled the memory of it now, spice and bitterness. He could sense his own worm waiting, the urn of the desert. This is really nice foreshadowing in the second read. And I'm always going to encourage people to read a book at least twice, just to appreciate details. Bygones, bygones, Bijaz muttered as they went. Let bygones fall where they may. This has been a dirty day. I just included this because I have somewhat recently rewatched a bit of Ally McBeal, and bygones is said in practically every episode with a much different mood. Chapter 18. Paul hands over Bijaz to Stilgar, who spirits him away. Paul remains on the streets as his soldiers begin to make arrests, so he is present when a stone burner is used to destroy Othaim's house, causing everyone in proximity to lose their eyes. This made me question whether this was the terrible fate, but there's still about 90 pages to go, so it was unlikely. I do like that the stone burner is foreshadowed so early in the book, but it also means that there are some inconsistencies introduced in this chapter. A wind of the massive whirled sand and dust down the narrow street, causing Bijaz to blink and shield his eyes. A nice preview of what will soon happen. An abrupt sense of peril, very near, was followed almost immediately by a figure joining them out of a doorway. Nice. It was only Stilgar, moving like a war machine, head thrust forward, feet striking the street solidly. Nice use of war machine. Would that be Stilgar's wrestling name? But no, it's a superhero, isn't it? My mistake. We want live prisoners, one of the guard officers hissed. The sound was a vision echo in Paul's ears. It went with solid precision here. Vision reality, tick for tick. Ornithopters drifted down across the moon. I do hate the forward slash in fiction, but nice of vision echo and drifted. A soft hiss grew out of the other sounds, climbed to a roar while they still heard sibilance. It picked up a terracotta glow that hid the stars, engulfed the moon. Paul, knowing that sound and glow from the earliest nightmare glimpses of his vision, felt an odd sense of fulfillment. It went the way it must. Nice description, and it is some kind of relief not to have to dread something anymore because it's happening. Stone burner. The cry was all around him. Stone burner, stone burner. Because it was required of him, Paul threw a protective arm across his face, dove for the low lip of a curb. It was already too late, of course. Nice use of the lip of a curb. Also interesting that the streets have curbs. Also, I really do appreciate that Stoneburner was foreshadowed so early in the book without giving a clue that it would be relevant again. Herbert often isn't that subtle with his foreshadowing. Where Otham's house had been, there now stood a pillar of fire, a blinding jet roaring at the heavens. It gave off a dirty brilliance which threw into sharp relief every ballet movement of the fighting and fleeing men, the tipping retreat of the ornithopters. Nice use of dirty brilliance and tipping retreats. The thing's radiation, which no man could outrun, already had penetrated their flesh. The peculiar result of Stoneburner radiation already was at work in them. What else this weapon might do now lay in the planning of the men who had used it, the men who had defied the great convention to use it. I am skeptical of radiation having only that one effect, but I accept the premise. Paul remained silent, thinking what this weapon implied. Too much fuel in it, and it had cut its way into the planet's core. Dune's molten level lay deep, but the more dangerous for that. Such pressures released and out of control might split the planet, scattering lifeless bits and pieces through space. It's wonderful ironic to think that someone might have miscalculated and blown up this all-important planet. Someone closer to it than I was, Paul thought. He could still see to the end of the cul-de-sac when he lifted his head, although there was a mistiness across the scene. A red-yellow glow filled the area where Otham's house and its neighbor had been. Pieces of adjoining buildings made dark patterns as they crumbled into the glowing pit. A very nice description of this nightmarish scenario. Paul climbed to his feet. He felt the Stoneburner die, silence beneath him. His body was wet with perspiration against the still suit's slickness, too much for the suit to accommodate. The air he drew into his lungs carried the heat and sulfur stench of the burner. Lovely. As he looked at the troopers beginning to stand up around him, the mist on Paul's eyes faded into darkness. He summoned up his oracular vision of these moments, then turned and strode along the track that time had carved for him, fitting himself into the vision so tightly that it could not escape. He felt himself grow aware of this place as a multitudinous possession, reality welded to prediction. I like that this is now a no turning back scenario. Paul is only able to see if he adheres to his prescient visions. The thwack thwack of many thopters grew louder all around. There was the sound of hurrying feet. Paul watched his friends come, matching their sounds to his oracular vision. If Paul was a superhero, he would now be Daredevil, and he could do much worse, I think. In the sudden silence, Paul's vision showed him Stilgar staring with an expression of agony at the ruined eyes of his friend and emperor. And yes, there is a conflict in this, such as how could Paul's prescience show him things which he can't see? Could he ever see them in his visions? It's just, it doesn't really work for me, but again, I accept the premise. We live by Atreides law now still. The Fremen law that the blind should be abandoned in the desert applies only to the blind. Well, okay, I guess. I wouldn't mind this as much if we hadn't already seen this law not being in effect. I suppose it's understandable in a way. The demands imposed by desert life could mean that a blind person could be an unacceptable burden, in a way, I guess, but I don't really feel it. And it's not even practical in the way that the tribe could use the blind person's water after they're dead because they're abandoned in the desert. This doesn't fit into my view of not only the world but also the Fremen. Turning, Paul summoned a weapons specialist, one of the eager and brilliant new breed who remembered siege life only dimly. Nice description of the sometimes creepiness of someone being an expert in an unsavory field. Paul nodded, thinking of how this man's mind must be racing. Atomics. The Great Convention prohibited such weapons. Discovery of the perpetrator would bring down the combined retributive assault of the great houses. Old feuds would be forgotten, discarded in the face of this threat and the ancient fears it aroused. This also shows an inconsistency because we were told earlier that stone burners skirt the line of the Great Convention and that there was no outcry when it was used against Paul's soldiers in the Jason. It wasn't even common knowledge that it had happened. Chapter 19, in which we see a telling conversation between a distraught Shani and Paul, followed by a sort of pre-trial of Corba the panegyrist. Apparently there is evidence that he arranged for the import of the stone burner. We were told of his plans to martyrize Paul, but it doesn't feel like this is properly underpinned because of the lacking element of him wanting Cheney to be the one responsible and take the blame. It's fine, though. Paul used the occasion to air out what other conspirators there are among the Fremen leaders, and to demonstrate to everyone that he can see even without his eyes. Some Fremen have even managed to flee Arrakis with a sandworm. This pre-trial contains making a show of obeying Fremen law. Paul and Stilgar conspiring without even informing Alia, which frustrates her to a significant degree. After 7 days of radiating fevered activity, the keep took on an unnatural quiet. On this morning there were people about, but they spoke in whispers, heads close together, and they walked softly. Some scurried with an oddly furtive gait. Nice description of the tension after this treason. Cheney stilled a fit of trembling when he aimed those empty sockets at her. She'd given up asking him to explain. He spoke so oddly. I was baptized in sand, and it cost me the knack of believing. Who trades in face anymore? Who'll buy? Who'll sell? This is wonderfully tragic. If Paul were more open with her, she wouldn't feel so weird about being honest with him. It is also a fascinating contrast against Paul's very orderly inner monologue. Hunger satisfied, Cheney slipped from the bed, glanced back at Paul, noted his tiredness. Grim lines framed his mouth. Nice use of grim lines. She put a palm against his chest, counting his heartbeats. His love cried out to the Fremen spirit in her, torrential, outpouring, savage. A magnetic power enveloped her. Nice reinforcement of the affection underpinning their relationship. The knot in my stomach isn't getting any lighter, though. She wondered then why he always spoke of the life within her as singular. Hadn't the medics told him? She searched back in her own memory, curious that the subject had never arisen between them. Surely he must know she carried twins. She hesitated on the point of raising this question. He must know. He knew everything. Even more tragedy. If Paul had been open with her about his choices, she wouldn't think it's needless to talk to him. Presently, she said, "Yes, love, this is forever. This is real." And she closed her eyes tightly, lest sight of his dark sockets stretch her soul from paradise to hell. No matter the Riani magic in which he'd enciphered their lives, his flesh remained real, his caresses could not be denied. Nice use of enciphered. According to the Dune Wiki, Riani apparently means a kind of forbidden magic to the Fremen, while it is also the ability that allows a Bene Gesserit to identify a face dancer without fail. And somehow the BT didn't know that Paul would have this capacity? But his mood had changed. You can't build politics on love, he said. People aren't concerned with love. It's too disordered. They prefer despotism. Too much freedom breeds chaos. We can't have that, can we? And how do you make despotism lovable? Paul does have his unlikable moments, to be sure. What's law? Control? Law filters chaos, and what drips through? Serenity? Law, our highest ideal and our basest nature. Don't look too closely at the law. Do, and you'll find the rationalized interpretations, the legal casuistry, the precedents of convenience. You'll find the serenity, which is just another word for death. I understand why Cheney is daunted by this kind of utterance. Cheney's mouth drew into a tight line. She couldn't deny his wisdom and sagacity, but these moods frightened her. He turned upon himself, and she sensed internal wars. It was as though he took the Fremen maxim, never to forgive, never to forget, and whipped his own flesh with it. Punishing yourself doesn't really change that much for anyone but you. Where was the insecurity of things that were only probable, he asked himself. His mind carried such a burden of mutilated memories. For every instant of reality there existed countless projections, things fated never to be. An invisible self within him remembered the false pasts, their burden threatening at times to overwhelm the present. It is unsustainable, isn't it? And I realize that not many weaknesses have been introduced that hampers Paul's powers. I mean, his superpowers sees through everything. Once more the vision arose from its black pit, locked onto him. It was his eyes. It moved his muscles. It guided him into the next moment, the next hour, the next day, until he felt himself to be always there. I do appreciate how losing his vision locks him more into the senses he does have. Alia's day began with a guard squadron swarming into the parade yard below her quarters. She stared down at a scene of frantic confusion, clamorous and intimidating babble. The scene became intelligible only when she recognized the prisoner they'd brought, Korba the panegyrist. Nice feature of a parade yard. Her gaze kept straying to Korba. She tried to remember him as the rough and bearded commander of the Third Wave in the Battle of Arrakeen. It was impossible. Korba had become an immaculate fop, dressed now in a Parato silk robe of exquisite cut. Alia is consistently presented as being intensely Fremen, and this is very different from how the Fremen has always been shown. Alia moved her gaze across the Fremen faces, trying to recapture memories of the original men. The present blotted out the past. They'd all become hedonists, samplers of pleasures most men couldn't even imagine. There is judgment here, but it's slightly reminiscent of Farak saying he wanted to return to tradition even when there's no need for it. He wanted things to be as they used to be, while not respecting the law of abandoning his son in the desert. Their uneasy glances, she saw, strayed off into the doorway into the chamber where they would meet. They were thinking of Muad'Dib's blind sight, a new manifestation of mysterious powers. By their law, a blind man should be abandoned in the desert, his water given up to Shai-Hulud. But eyeless Muad'Dib saw them. Okay, but why should blind people's water be a religious gift? Why aren't they sacrificed like the virgins are sacrificed? Do they render the virgins they sacrifice? These are questions I didn't expect to have. Despite the special reverence held for Caladan as a place of Paul's birth, the Lady Jessica had emphasized her refusal to make her planet a stop on the Hajj. No doubt my son is an epochal figure of history, she'd written, but I cannot see this as an excuse for submitting to a rabble invasion. Again, not very nice judgment, but then again, I don't really like Jessica. Part of me wanted to see more of her, to see if Herbert manages to reconcile her contradictive sides, but I wasn't sad not to see her in this book at all. because I don't like her. I kind of hope that she's not in the other ones either, but I understand the risk. And I like her even less now because it's obvious that Alia craves her guidance when she's seemingly all alone. So it is so Jessica is even worse off from hiding on Caladan. Thinking of her mother afflicted Alia with the usual inward blurring. The spice change that had mixed the psyches of mother and daughter forced her at times to think of Paul as a son to whom she had given birth. The capsule complex of oneness could present her own father as lover. Ghost shadows cavorted in her mind, people of possibility. Uncomfortable. You produce a deadly paradox, Jessica had written. Government cannot be religious and self-assertive at the same time. Religious experience needs a spontaneity which laws inevitably suppress, and you cannot govern without laws. Your laws eventually must replace morality, replace conscience, replace even the religion by which you think to govern. Sacred ritual must spring from praise and holy yearnings, which hammers out a significant morality. Government, on the other hand, is a cultural organism particularly attractive to doubts, questions, and contentions. I see the day coming when ceremony must take the place of faith and symbolism replaces morality. I have spent a lot of time thinking about this because it feels like a significant insight. What I have come to think that this means, and I might easily be wrong, is that for an act to be religious, it must be motivated by worship, like ecstatic belief. In government, a lot of things are done pro forma. Legalism must be honored in every case for it to be valid, even if it's not motivated by sentiment in any particular one case. I think that's what this means. What makes a weird contradiction for me is that it seems to me that the crucial thing about doing governmental acts is the effects, while the religious importance is in what motivates the act. So as these are presented here, as I interpret them, they are different from one another rather than in opposition. I do believe in secular government, but my view doesn't fit into this argument because it seems like Jessica is saying that legalism can't include a secular morality. If someone has a better explanation for what she means, please educate me. I would love to know. 4 guard Amazons in green watch robes came to attention as she entered. They fell into step behind her, striding firmly in the bravado of their youth, eyes alert for trouble. I like this similarity to what the Fedaykin are for Paul, which sets these Amazons up for their own tragedies sometime. Abruptly, the doors to the parade yard opened wide at the far end to admit a glaring shaft of daylight. Nice use of admit and glaring shaft. Corba was brought in, seated at a low table with cushions beside it on the chamber floor below the dais. Despite his finery, the panegyrist gave the appearance now of a surly, sleepy old man, huddled up in his robes against the outer cold. I don't really know how I feel about Corba. He does represent abject hunger for power, because he was happiest when he could execute Paul's religious duties. As the gravity of her statement penetrated, stillness came over the naives, but Alia marked angry stares across the rows of faces. She named them in her mind for discussion in council: Hobars, Rajifiri, Tasmin Sajid, Umbu, Leg. The names carried pieces of Dune in them: Ambu Sich, Tasmin Sink, Hobar's Gap. I can't really think it's good to, for a dictator to scour out the names of their enemies so that they can discuss their downfall. It's not so very bad, but it feels a little bit scummy. Stilgar produced a brown spice paper scroll, stepped forward. He began reading, a solemn flourish in his voice as though to hidden rhythms. He gave the words an incisive quality, clear and full of probity. Nice use of hidden rhythms and probity. Alia listened broodingly, chin planted on her left fist, head cocked to that side, the other arm extended along the chair arm. Bits of the formal procedure began dropping out of her awareness, screened by her own feelings of disquiet. It's interesting that Alia has lost interest in this very serious activity. Shouldn't she be hyper aware of every detail? It's about the longevity of the empire she is a part of. Before he could mask it, mystical terror lay briefly on Corbett's face. It was there for anyone to read. With her powers, Alia had but to accuse him herself, saying she brought the evidence from the shadow region, the Alam al-Mital. Korba has been fervent in promoting their religious powers, so to have that turned against him must be terrifying. Also, Alam al-Mital was spelled differently in the first book. It's a nitpick, to be sure, but it's also a needless distraction. Paul put down a momentary feeling of pity for Korba. The man lay trapped in the vision snare as securely as any of those present. He played a part, no more. Personal responsibility is still a thing, and it's worrisome that Paul is seeing past it. Korba mustered a pitiful air of pomposity to plead. Who accuses me? Nice use of pomposity. Alia experienced the odd sensation she was hearing Stilgar's words before he spoke them. How could he be this credulous? Stilgar had never appeared more official and conservative, more intent on adhering to the Dune Code. His chin was outthrust, aggressive, his mouth chopped. Was there really nothing in him but this outrageous pomposity? Less nice, repeated use of pomposity. Now what? Korba had relaxed. The panegyrist's manner said he'd suffered an unjust attack, that everything he'd done had been for love of Muad'Dib. She glanced at Korba, surprised, a look of sly self-importance sliding across his face. Korba believes he's safe because he's Fremen, and Paul can't punish him without implying to all the other powerful Fremen that he can do the same to them. However, this is undercut by Paul mentioning that Korba's action robbed a whole bunch of Fremen of their eyes, meaning that they must die or accept BT eyes. Alia swallowed in a dry throat, sharing the general fear of Paul in this moment. She knew how he moved among them without eyes, but the delicacy of it daunted her. To see their forms in the air of his vision. She sensed her person shimmering for him in a sidereal time whose accord with reality depended entirely on his words and actions. He held them all in the palm of his vision. Nice use of sidereal time. It's interesting that Alia feels trapped in Paul's powers, especially through this. The clerk, a wiry Fremen named Tekrube, carried himself with weary cynicism, flaunting his shaven head, clumped whiskers. Nice use of weary cynicism and clumped whiskers. You're preparing to disobey my brother, she said. I can read it in you. I only hope it doesn't destroy you both. This is a nice raising of tension. What will Stilgar do? She turned away before Stilgar could respond. His face, though, was filled with the things she'd sensed in her mother's letter, the replacement of morality and conscience with law. You produce a deadly paradox. I still don't see the contradiction that makes this a paradox. The law is interpreted all the time. Read a newspaper and find outrage on how a law has been interpreted. Chapter 20. Hate goes to confront Bijaz. He knows that the BT are devious and that Bijaz could be just another weapon aimed at Paul. This is where the clown mask falls from Bijaz's face. The BT knew that this would happen, and Bijaz's purpose is revealed to be to condition hate with an involuntary response and then erases the memory of the conditioning. When Paul is distraught by Cheney's eventual death, hate will deliver the offer of the BT to create a Gola of her. Bijaz informs hate that Paul is Harkonnen by blood, and since everyone who served the Atreides also hated the Harkonnen, hate will use Paul's distraction to be able to kill him. This is the ultimate plan, and it seems imperfect. Sure, Paul can't have seen visions of Bijaz delivering these orders to hate, but what if Cheney had died before Bijaz reached the palace? The BT would know that the Bene Gesserit would prefer Cheney dead, so why take that risk? Why not condition hate like this before giving him as a gift? The risk feels very profound. What I expected is that this offer of restoring Cheney as a Gola is the ultimate plan from the beginning. That about any Kwisatz Haderach destroying himself when he is proved to be something he isn't. I thought Paul would be so tempted to accept this offer, despite the fact that Cheney wouldn't want it, that he chooses to end himself to prevent the eventuality. I was wrong. You are not hate, the dwarf said. You are Duncan, Idaho. I was there when they put your dead flesh into the tank, and I was there when they removed it, alive and ready for training. This makes me wonder how many of the BT are actually goalless. The face dancers' bodies have features that normal humans don't, so they at least had to be products of that horrible controlled mutation. But that's different from being a Gola, so I don't know really. The light showed beads of perspiration on the dwarf's forehead. Bijaz seemed a creature of odd integrity, as though the purpose fashioned into him by the Tleilaxu were projected out through his skin. There was power beneath the dwarf's mask of cowardice and frivolity. I think we would be able to figure that out without having it spelled out. Hate found he didn't like the look of secret repose beneath the dwarf's expression. Nice use of secret repose. Well spoken, Bijaz said. Now we know each other. When two thieves meet, they need no introduction. Very clever, though I don't know if it's true. Hate stiffened, experiencing odd pains that played up and down his spine. He stared at the face of the dwarf, seeing youthful eyes in an old face. The eyes were the center of a network of knobby white lines which ran to the hollows below his temples. Such a large head! Every feature focused on the pursed-up mouth from which that monotonous noise issued. The sound made Hate think of ancient rituals, folk memories, old words and customs, half-forgotten meanings in lost mutterings. Something vital was happening here, a bloody play of ideas across time. Elder ideas lay tangled in the dwarf's singing. It was like a blazing light in the distance, coming nearer and nearer, illuminating life across a span of centuries. I like it. We are like brothers, Bijaz said, interrupting his monotonous hum once more. We grew in the same tank, I first and then you. And this makes me slightly uncomfortable. But the chapter made me really like Hate's character. I don't mind him at all, actually, despite Herbert's creative compromising. Hate's metal eyes inflicted him with a sudden burning pain. Flickering red haze surrounded everything he saw. He felt he had been cut away from every immediate sense except the pain, and he experienced his surroundings through a thin separation like wind-blown gauze. Having beachy eyes sounds like a very bad idea. Also, nice use of wind-blown gauze. With a clarity born of desperation, he broke through the gauze curtain with the lonely sense of sight. Nice use of lonely sense. Hate felt that his eyes cut through layers of the dwarf, seeing the little man as a hired intellect, and beneath that a creature imprisoned by hungers and cravings which lay huddled in the eyes. Layer after layer, until finally there was only an entity aspect being manipulated by symbols. The Gola Hate having a personality means that the Gola Bijaz has one too. There is a Duncan, Idaho in you, Bijaz said. It will submit to emotion or to dispassionate examination, but submit it will. This awareness will rise through a screen of suppression and selection out of the dark past which dogs your footsteps. It goads you even now while it holds you back. There exists that being within you upon which awareness must focus and which you will obey. And they believe that Idaho, a servant of the Atreides, will kill any Harkonnen they can. One day, Bijaz said, the Emperor will come to you. He will say, she is gone. The grief mask will occupy his face. He will give water to the dead, as they call their tears hereabouts. And you will say, using my voice, Master, O Master. You will say, I carry a message from Bijaz. The dwarf grimaced. Poor Bijaz, who has no mind. Poor Bijaz, a drum stuffed with messages, an essence for others to use. Pound on Bijaz and he produces a noise. This sounds to me like straight-up bitterness for the role he has been assigned, but he shows nothing but coherence with the BT. Oh, Bijaz said, and aha, click, click. There is more to the message. It is a trade that Tleilaxu offer your precious Paul Atreides. Our masters will restore his beloved, a sister to yourself, another Gola. He will be tempted, and in his distraction you will move close. In the instant you will strike. 2 Golas, not 1. That is what our masters demand. I like this reference to our masters, but we don't find out anything about the BT leadership, at least not in this book. And if you're not yet close enough to strike, speak of how much the Tleilaxu admire what he has taught them about the possibilities of religion. Tell him the Tleilaxu have a department of religious engineering, shaping religions to particular needs. Again, the BT undermining the accomplishments of others by having accomplished them already themselves. Hate felt himself floundering, caught in a matrix of objects he could not recognize. The dwarf appeared so sure of himself. There had to be a flaw in the Tleilaxu logic. In making their Gola, they'd keyed him to the voice of Bijaz. But what? Logic, matrix, object. How easy it was to mistake clear reasoning for correct reasoning. Was Tleilaxu logic distorted? It must be, in my humble opinion. Chapter 21. Alia, disturbed by the extent of Paul's powers, have taken an overdose of the unchanged water of life to gain insight of her own. It is really interesting to see Alia in ways mirror Paul. Just like he had risked his life against the training dummy keyed too high. And just like Alia, he had tried the space liquor when he felt his powers were inadequate. Alia doesn't get what she wants from the experience, and hate is present enough to call for a healer. While he doesn't remember being conditioned, he now experiences dread at the very thought of a dead female Atreides. He does stay to support her as she receives treatment, and it's very sweet. Hate watched Alia emerge from her temple and cross the plaza. Her guard was bunched close, fierce expressions on their faces to mask the lines molded by good living and complacency. I guess no one has ever tried to attack Alia. I'm sure that will wear off eventually. There was a boy across the way bouncing a ball in a cul-de-sac formed by a buttressed massif at the corner of the temple. Massif was a new word for me. According to Merriam-Webster, it means 1. A principal mountain mass, or 2. A block of the Earth's crust bounded by faults or flexures and is placed as a unit without internal change. So neither definition fits. One made a choice between dangers. Was that it? This was the way to penetrate the fog spread over the future by that damnable Dune tarot. A barrier existed, it must be breached. She had acted out of a necessity to see where it was her brother walked with his eyeless stride. To have a little prescience must be a terrible thing, and yet Alia knows how terrible it is to have a lot of it. The familiar melange fugue state began creeping into her awareness. She took a deep breath, experienced a brittle form of calm, poised and selfless. It's a very nice description of tender patience. Again she looked at the Gola. There was something inactive about him now, a latent something. He was saturated with waiting and with powers beyond their common life. That would be the conditioning, I guess. Maybe that's the reason the BT risked not doing it from the beginning. But then shouldn't they be worried that someone would notice the difference in hate before and after meeting with Bijaz? Out of my mother, I am like the Bene Gesserit, she said. Do you know that? Her mother is the most Bene Gesserit who has ever Bene Gesserited, I think, despite disobeying them. The Bene Gesserit stumbled, she said. Now they wish to regain their balance by leaping beyond my brother. They want Shani's baby or mine. I do wonder what the Bene Gesserit thinks would happen if they could produce their own Kwisatz Haderach in, 16 years from now? Why can't I see him, she muttered. The womb of all creation held her captive. Tell me, Duncan, why I cannot see him? It would be scary to have a single fact hidden from you. Mentat logic offered its prime computation, and he said, "The Bene Gesserit want a mating between you and your brother. It would lock the genetic." A wail escaped her. "The egg in the flesh," she gasped. A sensation of chill swept over her, followed by intense heat. The unseen mate of her darkest dreams. Flesh of her flesh that the oracle could not reveal. Would it come to that? Well, it's your choice, sweetie. You don't have to do anything. "Have you risked a dangerous dose of the spice?" he asked. Something within him fought to express the utmost terror at the thought that an Atreides woman might die, that Paul might face him with the knowledge that a female of the royal family had gone. It does add layers to hate that he is this loyal, and it would be so tragic if he were forced to kill Paul. "Look at the shield wall," she commanded, pointing. She sent her gaze along her own outstretched hand, trembled as the landscape crumbled in an overwhelming vision, a sand castle destroyed by invisible waves. It is not a good trip for Alia. The bed flowed with many bodies, all of them her own. Hallucinations. Wonderful. The Gola loves me, Alia thought. The thought became bedrock to which she might cling. He was a familiar face with a solid room behind him. She recognized one of the bedrooms in Paul's suite. It is nice that their relationship, maliciously set up from the beginning, might actually be a good thing. "Stay, Duncan," Alia whispered. He stroked her hand to tell her he'd heard. "Aw." And she shuddered, knowing she saw the vision her brother had seen. Unwanted tears burned her eyes. She shook her head sharply. No tears. They wasted moisture and, worse, distracted the harsh flow of vision. Paul must be stopped. Once, just once, she had bridged time to place her voice where he would pass, but stress and mutability would not permit that here. Being disallowed to cry is so ruthless, and her ability to communicate with Paul that way was apparently as overpowered as I said in my video. Kudos to me. The web of time passed through her brother now like rays of light through a lens. He stood at the focus and he knew it. He had gathered all the lines to himself and would not permit them to escape or change. I don't know if Herbert wants us to think anything but Paul being in control of the future. "I wanted to be able to laugh," she whispered. Tears slid down her cheeks. "But I'm sister to an emperor who's worshipped as a god. People fear me. I never wanted to be feared." Alia crying hits a little bit harder than anyone else. She had been possessed by emotion, a single constriction made up of fear, grief, and love. They lay there in the vision, all collected into a single epidemic body, overpowering and primordial. Nice use of epidemic. "They drive him to destroy himself," she gasped, arching her back. "Too much weight, too much grief. They seduce him away from love." She sank back to the bed. "They're creating a universe where he won't permit himself to live." Paul needs Chani, obviously. She has always been the one grounding him, the joy of his life. Fantastic. She knew she had tasted the life of a child not yet conceived. One thing certain about this child, it would suffer the same awakening she had suffered. It would be an aware, thinking entity before birth, which is just too tragic, considering how much Alia loathes her existence. Chapter 22. They have traveled to Siege Tabar for Chani to give birth. Paul has ordered the whole gang to come along, including Irulan, Mahayam, Edric, Saitel, and Bijaz. Chani is profoundly unsettled and feels very bad for the future and about the changes to her life and the planet since the terraforming. It doesn't help that Paul is acting erratically. She asks for him, and he doesn't come. Hate realizes that he has been primed with a compulsion and goes to deliver this news to Paul. The tension could not get any higher. The desert, the desert. She felt that the desert had followed her wherever she had gone. Coming back to the desert was not so much a homecoming as a turning around to see what had always been there. This chapter is so sad, knowing that Paul expects Chani to die. And I'm sure that it's normal for impending mothers to feel doubt at this moment, but it's really sad that there isn't any hope for the future mixed in with it. She faced into the wind, saw a worm appear outside the plantings. It arose like the prow of a demon ship out of the dunes, threshed sand, smelled the water deadly to its kind, and fled beneath a long burrowing mound. She hated the water then, inspired by the worm's fear. Water, once the spirit soul of Arrakis, had become a poison. Water brought pestilence, only the desert was clean. It is fascinating that water remains a prominent symbol, and I wonder if it will stick. What storms did Paul see with his eyeless visions? She sensed a vicious madman in him, someone weary of songs and polemics. It is such a tragic thing to think about the person who should be supporting her in this moment. She turned, saw the Gola calling to her outside the upper entrance to the siege. Fremen fears gripped her. Clean death and the body's water claimed for the tribe, these she understood. But something brought back from death. This is a nice reinforcement that Chani would never choose to be a Gola, and it reinforced my belief that Paul would do whatever extreme was necessary to prevent it from happening, including taking his own life. He felt that his mental faculties had been dulled, let out a long shuddering breath. A psychic shadow passed over him. In the emotional darkness of it, he felt himself waiting for some absolute sound, the snap of a branch in a jungle. The fantastic representation of fear of something hunting you. Thoughts with fussy edges feathered away into darkness, unknown. Nice use of feathered and fussy edges. Chapter 23. Hate goes to Paul, and they are both told that Chani is dead, triggering their conditioning. Hate feels the compulsion to kill Paul, but it turns out that that goes against the highest morality of Duncan, Idaho. And realizing this makes Hate reach the impossible point of remembering all of his lost memories, becoming Duncan, Idaho. But Chani is dead, and it's sad. It's really sad. Paul is astonished that she had twins because he only foresaw a daughter who, to his credit, he thought would take over the throne. So we had a shot at undoing the patriarchy, but now there's also a boy. He is overwhelmed with emotion, so I guess it's understandable for him to not to immediately realize that the only reason for him not to have seen someone is because they have prescience. He meets his two children and says goodbye to Chani, and then Alia brings Sightale, who delivers the offer to make Chani into a Gola. And Hate is now proof that they can make a perfect one with full memories, which was the point of conditioning him to do something that Duncan, Idaho would never do. When Paul doesn't want to listen to the proposal at all, Sightale threatens the children. Paul has lost his prescience when he no longer wants to live without Chani and is thus blind, but he can momentarily connect mentally with his infant son and see through his eyes. Therefore, Paul can kill Sightale. It makes it pretty clear that the son is like Paul, and it makes sense because the Bene Gesserit did think that Paul would have been a girl and that he would give birth to the Kwisatz Haderach. Paul decides to name the girl Ganima, which is why we were reintroduced to the word, despite the devaluation of its meaning. And he names the boy Leto, which seems a hint weird to me. It was the name of his first son, and this other son shouldn't feel like a replacement, but sure. And then comes the best twist of the book, because it is revealed that Bijas seems to be more of a mastermind than Sightale was. And he has personal stakes in the whole thing, because as a Gola, he also wants to remember his blocked memories. Bijas extend the same offer to turn Chani into a Gola, and Paul orders Duncan to kill Bijas before he can be tempted to agree. So I was all wrong about Paul killing himself in this situation. He wanted to flee from his own mind. It was a beast come to devour him. Awareness lay in him, sodden, heavy with all the living it had sponged up, saturated with too many experiences. Nice use of sodden. Paul felt himself arriving at a place which had claimed him from the beginning. He stood suspended. The Jason had seized him, fixed him onto a glide path from which the terrible gravity of the future would never release him. Nice use of glide path, and also get on with the story, please. He turned toward the siege. He knew this place. It was a place where he could not hide. His unrushing vision illuminated the entire Fremen mob. He saw Tandis, felt the Fedaykin's grief, the fear and anger. It's nice to see that others are very sad about Chani. Like they grieve themselves, and not just because they are scared about what Paul will do. He became a motionless chain of relative existence, singular, alone. Old memories flooded his mind. He marked them, adjusted them to new understandings, made a beginning at the integration of a new awareness. A new persona achieved a temporary form of internal tyranny. The masculating synthesis remained charged with potential disorder, but events pressed him to the temporary adjustment. The young master needed him. This makes very clear that hate remembering Duncan's life creates a new identity. Masculating doesn't seem to be a standard English word, but masculation means a blemish or the arrangement of spots and markings on an animal or plant. Very useful. 2 babies? Again he stumbled. Chani, Chani, he thought. There was no other way. Chani, beloved, believe me that this death was quicker for you, and kinder. They'd have held our children hostage, displayed you in a cage in slave pits, reviled you with blame for my death. This way we destroy them and save our children. I still think Chani deserved to be fully informed, but that point is kind of done by now. This was more than a death watch, less than a wake. Paul felt his soul begging for respite, but still the vision moved him. Just a little farther now, he told himself. Black, visionless dark awaited him just ahead. There lay the place ripped out of the vision by grief and guilt, the place where the moon fell. It is really nicely poetic that the moon in his vision was the representation of Chani. Paul felt himself accepting now the fact that Chani was dead. He had taken his place in a universe he did not want, wearing flesh that did not fit. Every breath he drew bruised his emotions. 2 children! He wondered if he had committed himself to a passage where his vision would never return. It seemed unimportant. Paul. Frustration and tears battled in her voice. Again, Alia's tears are more impactful. No matter, he could not turn his awareness from the vision of her face, such a mirror of eternity in the still features. He turned away, but the vision moved with him. She was gone, never to return. The air, the universe, all vacant, everywhere vacant. Was this the essence of his penance, he wondered? He wanted tears, but they would not come. Had he lived too long a Fremen? This death demanded its moisture. He tried to recapture the timeless mind dilation of the melange, but awareness fell short. No burst of the future came into this new consciousness. He felt himself rejecting the future, any future. Goodbye, my Sihaya, he whispered. It is so fucking sad. By which, of course, I mean it's super duper sad. Paul heard the voice moving. I need a vision, he thought. Darkness frustrated him. Bene Gesserit training warned him of a terrifying menace in Sightale, yet the creature remained a voice, a shadow of movement entirely beyond him. It's a nice use of a trope of not wanting your powers until you need them. And now he needs them to protect his children from Sightale, which he successfully does, of course, and then it's down to Bijaz to try to pressure him to restore Chani. But I am not, and the plan is not, Bijaz said. By the tank in which I grew, it can be done. I shall have my pasts, all of them. It needs only the right trigger. Trigger? Paul asked. The compulsion to kill you, Idaho said, rage thick in his voice. Mentat computation. They found that I thought of you as the son I never had. Rather than slay you, the true Duncan Idaho would take over the Gola body. But it might have failed. Tell me, dwarf, if your plan had failed, if I'd killed him, what then? Oh, then we'd have bargained with the sister to save her brother. But this way the bargaining is better. This exchange makes me question all of the cleverness attributed to the Bene Tleilax. Bijaz is not saying the right things at all. It's like the amoralism, that's probably not a word, but it's like they are too amoral to be able to figure out how to successfully manipulate Paul. There are problems in this universe for which there are no answers, Paul said. Nothing can be done. As he spoke, Paul felt his link with the vision shatter. His mind cowered, overwhelmed by infinite possibilities. His lost vision became like the wind, blowing where it willed. It is so sad. It is well worthy of the knot that was building throughout the second half of the book. Chapter 24. The final chapter, a sort of epilogue setting us up for the next part. I understand fully now why Herbert saw this book as a bridge to the next book. Paul has chosen to go into the desert, and the Fremen let him because of the law about blind people. It is, and that whole thing is better explained in this chapter. Rather than being a law about how blind people must be abandoned, it is presented as an expectation that anyone who is a burden to the siege will remove themselves. It's still not my favorite. It feels like a needed plot device. It's a very well deployed plot device, but a plot device nonetheless. If only we hadn't seen this law or rule or expectation not being executed by a traditionalist, it would be slightly better, but alas. The premonition of Paul destroying himself is fulfilled, but I do wonder at the reason. I choose to believe that it isn't because he can't tolerate not being the omnipotent Kwisatz Haderach. Rather, I think it's because he can't stand living knowing that he did in fact choose the course leading to Chani's death, even if it was the lesser of evils. He was wrong about the number of children, so maybe he was racked with guilt about making the wrong choices. I did think for a bit that realizing that his son has the same powers would motivate him to stick around, because Leto would surely benefit from the support of someone who understands him, but I guess Alia will have to fill that role. I'm sure the children will eventually have some spiritual experience in the desert, communing with their parents. Paul's death, and Paul's death not being confirmed by a body being found, is a bit troublesome for me, because there's a chance that he didn't die and might return, a possibility that isn't discouraged by the texts. I don't think favorably of the possibility of Paul's return, but then again, I thought that I would hate the Gola character, and it turns out that I like him. He's a totally fine character. Though I did like him better before he retrieved his memories. He is a fine love interest for Alia. It feels like the two of them are on equal footing, both of them having transcendent experiences. And the final scene is between the two of them. We also learn that the way that Stilgar disobeyed Paul was to execute Mahayim and Edric for their part in the conspiracy, against Paul's explicit instructions. The promontory of Siege Tabar dominated the night sky behind him. The light of both moons frosted its high rim. Nice use of promontory and frosted. There was a malignant simpering to the wind through the orchard. Nice use of malignant simpering. It was a skeleton desert here, Idaho saw. Moon-silvered ribs of rock showed through the sand. Then the dunes began. Nice use of skeleton desert and moon-silvered ribs of rock. Rhythms pranced in his awareness, leading his mind like a thrall down channels of remembered delight. Nice use of pranced. I did like hate more than this fully restored Duncan Idaho, though I can't really pass judgment on him until I see him in future books. The Bene Tleilax and the Guild had overplayed their hands and had lost, were discredited. The Kisseret was shaken by the treason of Korba and others high within it. and Paul's final voluntary act, his ultimate acceptance of their customs, had ensured the loyalty of the Fremen to him and to his house. He was one of them forever now. This does make a good job of engaging interest for the next book, to which this one was a bridge. And this shows that Paul didn't undermine his legacy at all, he reinforced it. It's just grief, she said, voice low. Just grief. Do you know what I must do for him? I must save the life of the Princess Irulan. That one. You should hear her grief. Wailing, giving moisture to the dead. She swears she loved him and knew it not. She reviles her sisterhood, says she'll spend her life teaching Paul's children. Alia and Duncan argue together, and yeah, it does seem that there might be redemption on the horizon for Irulan. And also, hopefully, Irulan as a Bene Gesserit can fill the role as that kind of teacher for the children, so that Jessica won't have to come back into the picture, because I still don't like her. And that's it. To be continued. This was really intense, guys. Good and bad. Part 1 was really tough, but I do feel I have more insight into the critique I've avoided hearing the details about the white savior aspects and all related topics. One of these days, I will make a video about my contradictive feelings about the concept about death of the author. And maybe I'll make one dedicated to my feelings about appendices. The appendices of Dune does give examples both of what I consider to be good and bad versions. Would you be interested in something like that? Let me know. I invented a new metric, an average quotes per page, measuring how many quotes I pulled, and it works as a comparison between books with the same formatting, which these seem to have. And it's reflected in the length of this script. I both had more quotes per page for the second book, and I had more to say about each quote. There was more to unpack. I had stronger feelings that I don't quite get it, which is frustrating. And I think I will need to have someone fully explain everything to me at some point. Maybe via a book like a companion to Dune. I'm sure those exist. But I don't want that exhaustive explanation yet. I want it when I'm done reading. And after I get my explanation, I might read them all again and reappreciate everything. Or be really upset about things. You never know. Right now, I do feel that I will do the third book next. I do own it. But I don't know if I have it in me to go for the 4th and 5th and 6th. I don't even own those yet. If the third book is gripping, then sure, I will do the rest. But I might take a break with another author. For instance, I bought Fairy Tale by Stephen King to get to the free shipping mark when I bought these 3. And I've never read a Stephen King before, so that might be interesting. And I got the Wheel of Time, the first 3 in the Wheel of Time series as a present for Christmas. And I haven't read those either. I know, how dare I call myself a fantasy fan. But that would be interesting. I did see the first season of the Wheel of Time series, so I have some grasp. I don't remember, I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, so it's not a great not a great point for a comparison, but I want to read them, and people might enjoy that. And it doesn't feel so bad to give spoilers about such old literature, because people have had plenty of times to check them out if they want. I do have so many books that I want to appreciate, and it's not all of the books I have is suitable for this format, I've realized, because when I was, conflicted and whatever, and I took a break, I did read the Riddle Master trilogy by Patricia A. McKillip, which is she's wonderful. The book, they are great. I hadn't read them since a very long time ago, but they wouldn't be suitable for this format because they're the world building is too intense, and I love the way she world builds, but it would be so many quotes required to make it, tangible for for a summary. So I have things to think about, and a colleague of mine told me that the British rapper Akala has written a book. It's a fantasy. It's a young adult fantasy, but I don't mind young adult genre books, especially if they're good, then they're great. And it had this really outrageous idea, which I've never had before, that I might try to read all of the books I own which I haven't read. And you think, duh, that's not a very strange idea. You do buy books in order to read them. But I have always accepted that I will buy more books than I'm going to read because I have unreasonable ambition for myself. But what if I read all of them? I have books that I have owned for like 20 years and not read. That would be interesting, I think. It's too many videos, but I might manage to read everything, which is fun, for me at least. And for the next video, I'm not super pumped about reading Children of Dune, but I will, and I'll make the best effort I can. And I am excited that I'm going to I'm opening up a fresh one of these for the notes, which is always fascinating, always thrilling to do. Still not sponsored. I would love to, though. Reach out. I'm here, available. That's about it for today. What are your thoughts about Dune Messiah? Were you disappointed by Paul's arc? Did you like the Gola? Tell me everything down in the comments. I am feeling good about this series so far. Both of the books, even though I've been a bit conflicted, and my humble contribution. It's going well, I think. It's only gonna get better from here. I am seriously thinking about showing the exercises I do to underpin my vocabulary, to incorporate the writing part of my mission statement for this channel. I also have an idea for a kind of live stream, but I think I'm gonna have to hold off on that. I've never seen myself as streamer material. But then again, I never saw myself as a YouTube kind of person, but you never know. I think I have to get a little bit more comfortable with the camera first. So, if you like this video, do please leave a like, share it with your friends if that's the kind of thing you do, and subscribe for more micro appreciation. And now, just for funsies, let's do some vocabulary appreciation, because we do want to expand our active vocabularies to keep those tricky to use words at the ready when they're suitable. These are the words that made it into my vocab training list. Atonal, panegyrist, benignity, because of the pronunciation. I guessed benignity, but realizing that I had never said this word aloud before, I checked Merriam-Webster. Clerestory, haruspices, shibboleth, glaucus, glyptic, trellist, sidereal, massive, polemics, masculation, and premonitory. Thanks for watching. Bye!